Sidak Atnakistan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll. Hello, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I am Atna from the native village of Klutika along the Copper River in Alaska. And I'm here to talk to you about the significance of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. First, I'd like to recognize today that I am on the homelands of the Tanatham Nation and the lands of the Pasquayaki tribe here at the University of Arizona. I'm an assistant professor of public health and the associate director for the Native Nations Institute. When we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty, we like to ground our work with recognizing who Indigenous peoples are across the globe. Utilizing some United Nations definitions, we look to a strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, distinct social, economic, or political systems, and a resolve to maintain and reproduce ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. Most importantly, inherent sovereignty as Indigenous peoples is not dependent on recognition by nation states or others. This means that Indigenous peoples have a variety of statuses across the globe. In my own country of the United States, we have 574 federally recognized Indigenous nations, around 60 state recognized Indigenous nations, and an accurate account, but likely way over 100 non-recognized Indigenous nations. All of these hold the rights to their data. So what are these data? Indigenous data are data, information, and knowledge in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at both the collective and or the individual levels. So these are data about our resources and environments, about our land, our water, our geology, and so forth. Also data about us as individuals, so administrative data, legal, health, social, commercial, corporate data, and then data about us as collectives, about us as nations and peoples, our traditions and our cultural information, our languages, our oral histories, our literature, our ancestral and clan knowledge. Given our inherent rights, Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. As I said, it derives from our inherent rights to govern peoples, lands, and resources. We find genesis for Indigenous data sovereignty in the traditions, roles, and responsibilities for the use of community-held information. These position themselves in terms of how we stewarded information within our own communities, who could access that information, who was responsible for taking care of that information, the times of years that information could be shared, so on and so forth. So utilizing the systems that we've always had within our communities, both for storage, sharing, and use. And we position Indigenous data sovereignty within a human rights framework. So we utilize court cases, treaties, or federal and other recognition, but are not dependent on them. And finally, knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as peoples. Indigenous data sovereignty is an effort to move towards having more data capacity, infrastructure, and capability, as well as more data control, as we build up our nations in the same way in terms of being able to self-govern and self-determine our futures. This requires both governance of data, so stewarding both internal data that we have as Indigenous peoples and nations, but also influencing and co-producing policy and practice around how our data are stewarded external to our nations. So those data that might be in corporations or other governments, nonprofits, and so forth. And then recognizing on the flip side that we also need data for governance. So we need access to that data and the ability to use that data in the way that we see fit for decision making. This is complicated by the fact that identifying Indigenous data and collections is difficult and data can be hard to find at this time. So data can be buried in larger collections, data center repositories. Those data could have been collected now or centuries in the past and entered into these collections or repositories without the labeling that would say that these data belong to an Indigenous nation, or that Indigenous nation has rights to that data. And the metadata so do not include that information and therefore are not properly attributed. These are then not searchable. And so we have this situation where you have data and collections that others are using without permissions or attribution to Indigenous peoples and nations. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that Indigenous nations and peoples to whom this information belongs cannot access that information. So those collections are not fair in terms of the FAIR principles of being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these information can range from ethnographic material to biological materials to Earth observations and can be buried within scientific papers. So the problems in data and information infrastructure are that every Indigenous community has enormous collections of tangible and intangible cultural material, knowledge, and data that are held in external archives, museums, libraries, repositories, and other online databases. There's significant information about these collections, including individual and community names, and proper provenance information is missing. And so Indigenous peoples and communities are largely not the legal rights holders to these pieces of information then. There are issues of responsibility and ownership, as well as incomplete and significant mistakes in the metadata, and that continue into the digital lives of these materials as we move through the data life cycle. There are more researchers working and collecting data and samples from Indigenous communities now than ever before. So in an era of open data, big data, and open science, we see a need for figuring out how to include and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples to their data in these environments. So we understand that moving through the system means that we need to be both at once promoting Indigenous data governance, to move from data dependency and co-optation of Indigenous knowledge, and also decolonizing data. So moving towards putting Indigenous vision and values into how data are collected, analyzed, and used, so across the data life cycle, and then overlaying Indigenous aspirations for how to govern and steward that information within our systems. This requires that we have tribes or Indigenous nations governing their own tribal data, and then enhancing data relationships between tribes and other data stewards who are then, in this aspirational context, managing by tribal standards. And understanding within an Indigenous nations context that tribes have high control to govern data, such as their tribal enrollment data and other data that they generate, and much lower control in other scenarios. But there's room along this spectrum to be able to create these relationships so that Indigenous values are leading how we are storing information. One of the things that the Global Indigenous Data, a group at the Research Data Alliance, has done over the past year and a half is work towards creating and promoting the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. These principles come from that foundation of knowing that we are in this era of big data, open science, and we need to figure out ways to enhance those relationships between Indigenous peoples and other data stewards. And so the CARE principles set out 4 primary principles and then sub-principles for working through some of those relationships and responsibilities. So those are collective benefit for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable outcomes. authority to control, which recognizes Indigenous rights and interests in data, and also recognizes the need for data for governance, as well as governance of data from Indigenous perspectives. Responsibility for other data stewards for positive relationships, for expanding capability and capacity, for Indigenous languages and worldviews. And finally, ethics, which should be grounded in the community from which the data come from, for minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, for justice, and importantly, for future use. Thank you.